what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
The Climate Collective operate on the unceded territory of the Witsinit and the Quanman speaking Iqaluit and Dundee Nation. Through stewardship of the land continue to this day. Climate was founded in 2007 to support Indigenous struggles for sovereignty and cultural renewal and to mobilize non-Indigenous people to join us in this effort as we work towards dismantling the state and ending capitalism.
We would also like to acknowledge the genocidal conflicts currently taking place in Palestine, Lebanon, Sudan, and with the Uyghurs in China. We also acknowledge the Ukrainian resistance to Russian imperialism. The Seeds of Revolution podcast recognizes the struggle to dismantle the state and capitalism is an international effort and should always be at the forefront of our work.
I'm Nathan Moss.
I'm Kimberly Croswell.
We are happy to be your host for today's Seeds of Revolution podcast, broadcasting from Climate Bush and Infocop on unceded Quanman and Witsinit territory.
We are grateful to be speaking today with Kerry Coast, author of The Colonial Present, The Rule of Ignorance and the Role of Law in British Columbia, published by Clarity Press, which you can find online at claritypress.com. Beautifully written with a hard-hitting prose, Kerry demonstrates the injustices faced by the various Indigenous nations within BC, historically and into the present day, are founded in deep-seated ignorance.
This ignorance can be traced back to the root of white supremacy and a thriving capitalist colonial extractivist greed. These factors have been so normalized that they are practically invisible, but knowing them is necessary for both old immigrants and new immigrants to this land to come to terms with.
In addition to writing The Colonial Present, Kerry Coast is also the driving force behind the journal Archive Quarterly, in which she publishes documents related to the history of Indigenous resistance in BC and across Canada from her own archival collection. The journal is driving support and interest for the West Wasn't One archive project. Dynamically laid out with photographs, maps, and original document reprints, Archive Quarterly showcases how the past impacts the present for Indigenous peoples across Canada in many ways.
Thank you, Kerry, for your time and for sharing your story, creativity, and passion towards Indigenous. Can you move the screen up a little bit? Towards Indigenous sovereignty. It is an honor and a privilege to interview you today and learn a treasure trove of knowledge about the effort of colonialism in so-called Canada.
Respectful, thank you very much. It's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Kerry, would you mind telling us a little bit about your early years as a writer? How did you find your voice and solidarity with Indigenous struggles?
Yes, that's something that people in BC honestly mostly find by accident because the the struggles that we're talking about, the struggle for people's rights as peoples, which includes land and jurisdiction, is at the heart of the British Columbia Colonial Project. And so you almost have to accidentally find out by running into Indigenous folks and having that incredibly good luck to do so. And that's exactly what happened to me when I was about 20 years old. And I ended up meeting several people who were involved in life and death situations. And it's important for us to remember that they are life and death situations for Indigenous peoples here, where British Columbia has asserted sovereignty. And Nathan, you mentioned in the introduction about the normalization of our struggle and our situation here. And so very often, um, the average Canadian forgets that, and they look at a roadblock, or they look at the simple act of people driving through a middle of their reserve, which is now a provincial highway, and inconveniencing the traffic by 20 minutes because they're having a funeral. And so the importance of the urgency of the situation can't be overlooked, and I just want to mention that. So when I was about 20, I did meet people who were in incredibly urgent situations. Their, the valleys were being logged. In one situation, the very birthplace of the first woman was about to be logged by Interfor. And so all the people and all the hereditary chiefs and all the women went out and stood there and protected that place with their very bodies. And so, let's just use that. That was one of the instances that I happened to become aware of at the time in the mid '90s, and I ended up going to the court cases. So I heard what was being said by the government lawyers, like Jeff Plant would walk into the courtroom and begin his defense by saying, "Well, there never was any Aboriginal title in British Columbia, and if there was, it was displaced and extinguished by the assertion of Crown sovereignty." And that's how the government of British Columbia begins every case when they're prosecuting land defenders up until up until just about the year 2000, even after they had made public claims to the contrary. So when you accidentally stumble into a situation and you hear such outrageous statements coming from the highest levels of government, which are never reprinted in the press. The media isn't going to spell this out for us. They carefully avoid the most aggressive and violent lies of our governments while carefully suppressing the voices of those people who are the leaders in their community, who are standing up for their responsibilities to their lands and to their future generations. And so when you do find yourself in that situation, it's not something you can unhear. And I think that has really motivated me ever since I married into Mount Currie to Lealbot, and I have a beautiful daughter. Um, so, most all of my adult life has really, I've been um, connected to the need for justice and serious change here in this area. Being myself someone who's been displaced around the planet from Scotland via Ireland, via Australia, they moved us around like chattel. And when I got to meet these wonderful, wonderful Indigenous nationals from Chequapmec, from Newhawk, from Lealbot, from Sletland, from Stolo, which is where I am today in the beautiful Stolo country. It changed my life because I learned from those people what a real human expectation of a human life is, and I'm so grateful for that. That's moved me, and that has definitely informed a sense of responsibility in me to stay connected to that struggle here.
It is very clear Kerry, that you are forging deep connection with numerous Indigenous nations. How did you go about building trust in the relationship you developed with them?
Yeah, I appreciate this question. Is very important to us as non-native people living here. How do you connect to the people of the land where you live? And I believe that's one of the most important questions for us. And I think people should literally go walking into the local First Nation office and ask for themselves. How can they help? So, I live here, and is there some way that I can contribute? Some people pay taxes, some people offer services. So, in terms of my relationship, um, the relationships that I've developed are with individuals, not with nations. Okay, so and in fact, one of the things that I marvel at and deeply appreciate with a lot of the culture, the governance culture of the peoples of the land here is very seriously a culture that respects autonomy. So within one nation and one people, um, the different families have different lands, which are their title lands or their ancestral lands, and they all have a little bit different way. So being an indigenous nation is for those people. That's not really for me. In fact, I would say that, I have relationships with individuals and with families, and building trust is, as a white person, particularly here, you're coming from a place where you need to understand that every native person you meet has been double crossed and lied to by white people most of their lives. And so building trust is about um, being accountable. I mean, you have to show up. You have to do what you say you're going to do and not do ridiculous things and not um, yeah, don't appropriate other people's belongings. And there's a lot to learn from non-native people because stories and songs and images and ideas are really some of the most valued cultural properties. So I think it's a good question. How do you make a deep connection? How do you be reliable? And the best way to find that out is to have meaningful conversations with those folks where you live.
Thank you for sharing that. How did this important work of collecting Indigenous histories come to you?
Right. So I'm actually going to need to flip that question. The what I'm collecting has mostly has to do with the colonial history, and so
Ah,
this is a, it's the interaction between the British Columbia Colonial Project, which is, as we know, is a warehouse of people from elsewhere around the world that are here to extract resources. That's how it started. And up until 10 years ago, 80 cents on the dollar of British Columbia's economy came directly out of the ground, out of raw natural resources. Okay, 80 cents on the dollar. That is what we are doing here. We're taking fish out, we're cutting trees down and shipping them around the globe. We're mining like crazy. We're building hydro dams and sending electricity, mostly to new mines that are being made. So the work that I'm especially interested in is how does our quote unquote society, like this thing called British Columbia, what has it actually done here? And so, obviously, in order to understand that, um, you need to become conversant, at least if not fluent, in the real history of the people of the land here. But that's no easy task because where there is one sort of warehouse called British Columbia, there are 26 distinct languages, 26 distinct peoples, most of whom have diverse organizations within themselves as well. So, I the, there's no way that I would suggest I'm even aware of most Indigenous history in this area because I've only ever lived in Secwepemc territory up near Big Bar, near Canoe Creek, near Black Dome Mountain. And I've lived in Stalo country, and I've lived in Stutlam country. And so I've learned a bit about those areas, but then also I'm very curious naturally about other histories. And the most important thing I'm curious about is how has the British Columbia government continued to wrangle and manage these brutal policies, which I think we're going to get to shortly here, and then we'll talk more about that.
Thank you for making that clarification. It's very significant, and I appreciate that.
Kerry, you touched a little bit on it earlier, but was there a moment in your life when you were confronting that colonialism that brought you to a greater understanding of the importance of your message or your work?
Thank you. To my way of thinking, I definitely try to relay messages that are not getting through and that are not being properly documented. So they're not necessarily my messages, but they are the result of my education at what I call the University of the Kitchen Table, which is where most of my education, honestly, as an adult has happened. Talking to people at their homes or at conferences and even in the courtroom and out on the land. Was there a moment in which I realized the importance of the message of Indigenous self-determination? Yes, hundreds and probably and thousands of moments. I realized the importance of Indigenous self-determination and compensation for so many things. That's a whole nother subject. We'll just leave it at compensation for now. Every time a child is apprehended from their mom because of something as stupid as a social worker's own mistake of not documenting something properly, they show up at the hospital with cops and take the baby away from the mother. Every time a child is taken away, I'm reminded of the importance of Indigenous self-determination. Every time some poor little kid comes home from school and has to tell their parents that normal people don't talk about Indigenous stuff. Every time, up in the Site C Dam, how did that even happen? I mean, how did that even go through in Treaty 8, where those people have gone to court and shown that they can't even practice their treaty rights anymore because the level of logging and mining and hydroelectric activity and road building to achieve it, they can't even do the fishing and hunting and gathering that they were promised in a solemn treaty. I mean, never mind the rest of the parts of the treaty that were abandoned early on. So many moments, and what the most important thing that we're talking about today is the future of Indigenous peoples, and is British Columbia really gonna keep interfering in that future? So, that message is extremely important. And like I said at the beginning, one thing that non-Native people tend to forget while they're, working in their job or going to school or bettering their life or something, they really forget the fact that this is a life and death issue in Indigenous communities. And every time the laws of the land and the peoples of the land are disrespected and shoved aside or humiliated or made to accept an agreement that is not only falls short of international human rights standards, it's just outright shameful. And then you have our government celebrating that agreement as if and calling it a great step forward. it is not a great step forward, and to call it such is a great step backwards. So yeah, many important areas that Indigenous self-determination and compensation for past harms are critical at this time.
So, what made it clear to you that ignorance is the root of what we need to confront?
Yeah, so that's part of the title of the book I wrote in 2013, where I said, I said, British Columbia is really based on the rule of ignorance and the role of law, because you don't have to sit through many court hearings where Indigenous land defenders are involved to realize that what they call law that's going on in British Columbia, when the judges sit there with a picture of the Queen behind them and enforce what is British imperial convenience, is not law. It's a sham. And many lawyers have been disbarred and discredited, and really had their lives ruined for pointing that out. And the only way that this can be the norm in this province is that the vast majority of people are completely unaware of it. They're not aware, um, and this is really by design. When you scratch the surface of such such constructions by I'm quoting now, the special words and tactical team of the government that was developed in the 1980s to deliberately blur and frustrate and lose a lot of the meaning of what happens here. Okay, the special words and tactical team, a bunch of lawyers whose entire job was to obfuscate the situation. Okay, and in British Columbia, most of us come from places where, well, I think most of us, I'm not sure about the numbers, but many of us come from countries where our people have been pushed out to make way. We're the poorer ones. Some of us are the richer ones. Sorry, I'm generalizing now, but the thing is that we come from places where colonization is centuries and centuries and centuries ahead of where it is here, where our own displacement as families connected to the land has happened so many generations ago that we've forgotten a lot. And so when we look around and um, and like a situation where 80 cents on the dollar that we spend every day is coming straight out of somebody else's lands, somebody else's sacred headwaters. We don't really understand that. We don't really appreciate that. And so there's a huge amount of learning that is possible, an incredible opportunity for people in this part of the world to learn something absolutely precious and priceless from Indigenous people who are connected to their own culture, their own language, their own land, where that flows from, their own spirits sitting up on the top of their own mountains. We have a chance to become a lot less ignorant than we are. But this process of losing a connection, I think which a lot of people suffer from in British Columbia, and so they can't relate and they can't understand what's going on with the displacement of Indigenous people's own jurisdiction. That's a huge question. I think maybe I'm just going to leave it there for now.
Yeah, I'm deep in thought from your answer, Kerry. Can you speak to the role of the past in confronting the ongoing injustices of the present?
Yes, absolutely. I can give you a couple of examples of how things that have happened in the past have put us in this very precarious and ridiculous situation in the present. Actions that were taken by the imperial powers when Spain and Russia and Britain first arrived here in the Pacific Northwest in this part of the world. we have to remember, and we need a bit more education in the fact that Europe's land race for colonies around the world took place over a couple of hundred years, in the 1700s and the 1800s, for the most part, and they were fighting each other all the way. So when they got here, and the Russians and the British and the Spanish were kind of fighting uh, for control amongst themselves, and they were trying to elbow each other out of the way, um, while they were saying that they were competing for the right to trade with Indigenous people here, for the right to approach people here and make treaties. Okay, that's what they were saying the fight was about between themselves when they made treaties excluding each other from different areas. So the Russians were up in Alaska and they made a treaty about that. The British ended up in the middle here, and the Americans reached the west coast of North America, Iron 49ers in 1849. And so they completed that treaty between the Americans and the British. Things in the past that are affecting us today is that um, the British and their fur traders and their governors did not care how they got it. They just needed to maintain control. So one of the first actions of the government of British Columbia, was introducing smallpox via the Hudson's Bay Company forts. And they used the trading relationship, which had largely been built up by their predecessor, in order to access all these different people and actually distribute contaminated artifacts, and actually send people who were infectious with smallpox to go and visit people. And the result of that was that a huge proportion of the people here died. And before they could ever recover themselves, one of the next most significant actions of our government was to make their traditional ceremonies illegal, and to pass the Indian Act over people they did not have treaties with. They did not have consent to govern. They didn't even have constructive arrangements. The next thing that they did was carve out tiny little Indian reserves and then reduce those even smaller, where people kind of had to live. But that's the Indian reserves is a long story. It was one of the first actions of government. And then they passed the Indian Act, criminalizing any kind of resistance on the part of the, 10, 25% of people who survived the smallpox were now the named subjects in the Indian Act. There was over 200 things you could do as a Native person that would land you in jail, or you would be fined. And people were not allowed to own land. If they wanted to do that, they had to completely give up their rights as an Indigenous person. They had to enfranchise, and then they could vote. So these are the actions that we're living with now. This is why we have moved into all that space that was cleared by those early colonial actions, and that has never changed. So when we have headline news in 2024 and 2025 that there's a great breakthrough because 30 acres of land was given back to 3 Indian bands as compensation for their traditional territory, you look at that in context. What did I just say? We're talking about look at the entire Fraser Valley as an area and realize that there was a couple different nations who actually were based in this huge area. Okay. And all this time, since 1864, 1861, or 1875, they've been living on a few acres, just these postage stamp Indian reserves. And now, 150 years later, our government wants to give back 30 acres and call it a done deal. So in British Columbia, we are so far from actually visualizing a realistic plan of reparations and restitution, um, that Indigenous peoples can be self-determining, that they can have a future of their own deciding. We're so far from that reality right now. And part of it is that people do not understand that history. And when BC set up as a colony and it did these things and it passed outrageous laws like the BC Lands Act, just claiming it simply passed legislation and said, now we own all this land. And that was not true, but that is the bedrock of BC today. And um, that is literally the mountain that needs to be moved.
Thank you for sharing all that. It's really a really hard-hitting truth that I think we all need to take within us and really come to terms with on many levels. And I'm wondering, who is your audience? Have you received any responses to your work, especially your book?
Yeah, definitely. I think that uh, actually teachers in adult education like the book, and they particularly like to take maybe a chapter out of it because I'm just raising questions that aren't raised in the mainstream press, and I would take any opportunity to point out the fact that among the leaders in the universities and that you're finding a lot of individuals who support the BC treaty process, for example, and they kind of finish every question with, "Oh well, that's all sorted out now in the BC treaty process," which is an extinguishment and surrender. You can't get a treaty. You can't get government approval to use your land unless you first surrender your right to it and then accept whatever the government is offering you under British Columbia law with BC rules and regulations and BC control to do it. But unfortunately, we even have the most reputable academics working at UVic and SFU. I meant to say UBC, but I don't really know SFU that well. They finish every sentence with, "Oh, well, and now we have the BC treaty process." So I think that teachers like my book because it's actually has, it actually is presenting a researched argument that is fresh and it's actually accurate and it's informative. And so my audience is people who want to be better informed. It is a small audience at this point because I think a lot of people don't appreciate how much more informed they need to be. But I'm quite happy with that. I'm quite happy with working on research and documenting events and interviewing elders who were there at the time to find out what life was like, for instance, at that time. So I believe it's a small audience, but I'm not really trying to sell a book. I'm trying to contribute to the historical record, which has been kind of decimated by the colonial interest in suppressing it.
How did the archive quarterly come into being? It had an interesting subtitle. The Journal of the West Wasn't One. Could you please speak to that?
Yes, yeah, I would love to speak to that. So, the Journal of the West wasn't one. Well, that's the point. I mean, we wouldn't still need treaties in British Columbia if these issues have been resolved. These issues are not resolved. So anyway, in my time, I've had what I consider to be a great good fortune to meet um, amazing people who were extremely involved in the politics in their countries, particularly in Lilwat and throughout Scotland and elsewhere. And so I've collected those materials, okay? So I collected those press releases, and I made notes during interviews, and I collected those news clippings until it got to the point where it's a huge collection. The last estimate was that I have about 80 boxes of material, some of which was given to me by older folks who kind of realized that they weren't able to use it or employ it anymore, but they want it to be saved and protected. And so I've done that. And I digitize a lot of those documents, which have otherwise been kind of wiped from history by, I don't know if it's the government or the media or a combination, but all these inconvenient documents showing, for example, in the 1960s, when they built that huge hydro line, okay, all the way through the Lillooet River Valley, the deal was that BC Hydro, I don't think it was called that at that time, was going to electrify those little Indian reserves. You know, they were going to have little substations, and then all those communities would have electricity. Those communities did not get electricity until 50 years later. Okay, BC Hydro completely reneged on all of the agreements that they made to gain passage through that valley because it didn't belong to them. They can pass all the legislation they want, but at the end of the day, on the ground, it does not belong to British Columbia. It belongs to those peoples who have never abandoned it, they've never surrendered it, they've never sold it. And that's where we are. But this document and the secretary who documented these interactions between BC Hydro and the people and their promises, the cabin holding all of her notes and their records was burnt down. You know, and that they used to do that. I think in British Columbia, I know of 2 cases where the Indian Affairs Office was burnt down. I see it's not funny, but it's kind of hysterical. And also, and then, you know, there was residential schools, offices, and areas where information was kept and held were burnt down. And I don't really think that we have that same level of incidence of government building fires in the rest of this province. So keeping the information is really important. And that's why I have this archive. And so Archive Quarterly is a journal. It's a quarterly journal, which is just, you know, putting a few pieces of that unknown and not well understood information out there in a journal format. And the main idea there is to promote the fact that we need a proper archive. We need a decent library that does that somebody can walk into, and if they want to understand why there's an issue with apprehending Indigenous children, for example, they can go to that section. They can pull out the binders of news clippings. They can go to the bookshelf of agreements that our government has made with Indigenous organizations over the last 50 years, promising to restore their own power over their own children and family. And guess what? Every time that happens, no sooner than an agreement is made than the funding for it runs out. And maybe the government changes. Maybe there's a court case and the public has an outcry, but most likely it just gets buried. And that is a cycle that has repeated itself at least 5 times in the last 50 years. So we need an archive. We need a library that has all those agreements, that shows what happened in the fishery. Right now, you know, the DFO just snowball. I mean, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans just throws snowballs and avalanches over small communities who are absolutely dependent on fishing for salmon. And the DFO just runs huge, wide circles around them, promising things, taking the promises away. So where is the record of that? In order to understand how frustrated and how desperate and how urgent these issues are, we need to have that repository. We need that archive. We need that library, and it has to include and show these histories, and so we need to save that documentation, and we need it to be accessible. And that's my vision. That's what I would like to be able to contribute to in my lifetime. That's kind of what I'm good at, and I would hope that that would really support Indigenous peoples in the future. Then the Archive Quarterly is the journal that comes out of that archive, but I think I already said that.
Yeah, and we're going to get into some details because I'm interested in talking about the summer issue specifically. In that summer issue, you have a few sections about the important role women play in in what you call Indigenous national life to resist assimilation through the Indian Act. Would you mind saying a few words about this?
Sure, absolutely. Um, with the sexism that comes through the European side of colonization and imperialism, and I mean, really, it's kind of a men's world in the colonial world because you want gold miners, you want loggers, and so that sexist attitude really came strongly into Canada and British Columbia, and we lived with that. As Europeans, but that's not what culture was like here at all. Women had very important roles, not like in England where we might have a queen who would be surrounded by male advisors and basically speak for her. But what I think I'll do here is quote Jeanette Corbière-Lavelle, who was one of the absolute heroes of the women's movement in the sense that she never gave up. She stood up for her equal rights as a woman, for her equal right to have Indian status, such as it is, and the right to vote in her community, the right to return to her community, to be part of her community, even when Canadian regulations had favored men and totally removed women's matrimonial property rights through the Indian Act. And so she said very simply, she has a great interview in the summer issue, and I wanted to try to promote her many accomplishments just by this one interview. And she said, for example, and I'm just reading, our grand chiefs had the support of all the people, and women were part of that in making those decisions. And she says, now she's talking about citizenship among the communities, which has been totally disrupted by Indian status and Canada's taking on to itself the right to decide who has Indian status. And ultimately, they favored men there as well. But that's a longer story. So Jeanette Lavelle says, women were part of making those decisions, and we decided who our people are. She says, sometimes there's non-Indians there in our community, but they join our nation, and that's what happened. She says, we know who our people are. And she says there was equal responsibility. Women had roles, men had roles, not that they were exclusive, but women's roles was highly respected and influential. And she says, and in our teachings and in our clans, there was that balance. The women were responsible for certain aspects, the men for others. And that balance was eliminated by contact and the imposition of the government officials and their laws. They went with their European Western concept where women didn't have any rights. Women were bought. Women were chattel, really. And they couldn't even vote until recently. And so I think that this comparison Jeanette makes is just brilliant, because while women are essential in Indigenous communities in all types of areas, you look at Europe, look at England. Women didn't even vote until a century ago. Meanwhile, women were central decision makers among Indigenous cultures, for sure. And if you look at things like the land defense that has happened up at the Gidimt'en camp in Wet'suwet'en, or the Indigenous land defense that happens stopping ski resorts like at Shutikuk and Shwokwakwelt, and Katmuk, it was women were behind all of those movements. And it's because they they have the confidence of the people, I think. Well, there's so many reasons for that. Um, and so much to say on that subject, but maybe I can leave it there.
Well, moving over to the next issue of the Archive Quarterly. In the fall, you highlighted the Canadian policy of extinguishment, which later was evolved into moderated rights. When it comes to treaty negotiations and the endless Coaching report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, what are your thoughts on those issues? Is there a way to produce more tangible solutions than Canadian legal discourse and jargon?
Yeah, so I just want to kind of narrow it down a little bit in terms of what you're asking. We can talk about Canada's extinguishment policy and all the different names they have for it, but and it's it's definitely very frustrating. But I noticed that you're asking me here, are there more tangible solutions than
Yeah,
than what
yeah,
the Canadian legal discourse is providing?
yeah. And I also highlighted missing, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls because they have the same theme of evolving into endless reports and commissions and rulings that are not binding, and the UN that all the stuff and it doesn't add up to much. So that's why I kind of combined the two, because they both have this seemingly endless made of, like I said, commission and United Nations concern and presentations on how the state of Canada is not doing a good job on both of them. And so that's why I combined the two together.
Okay. Okay. So yes, absolutely. Um, the UN treaty bodies have criticized Canada harshly in both of these areas, because at this time, in spite of their clever phrasing and special words task force, Canada's mandate for negotiations or enabling any kind of Indigenous action on their own lands involves surrender. It involves extinguishment. So even when you have something called a jurisdiction agreement, that's the name of that agreement that First Nations are signing. But what's actually in that agreement is that they surrender their own jurisdiction and they consent to importing Canadian legislation over themselves, which they have never done before. And now they've got a delegated Canadian jurisdiction as part of the Canadian uh, political system. And so they're abandoning and extinguishing other rights in order to get that. And there's always money involved. Uh, Canada owes Indigenous peoples money for all kinds of things. But in this case, with education jurisdiction agreement, for example, um, you literally have to import the Canadian jurisdiction onto your people in order to get enough money to bring your school system up to par with what provincial schools are getting. So in every situation, Canada and British Columbia are really holding Indigenous communities over a barrel. And in order to get anything, like even equal funding for children and families, equal funding for education, equal funding for housing and infrastructure. And let's remember, it's not equal. It doesn't add up to the standards that other Canadians are used to. But even in order to get that, uh, Indigenous communities have to give something up every time. And that's what the extinguishment process, which is so abhorrent and reprehensible, that the UN treaty bodies remark on it when they review Canada. under these different international conventions, which is how the UN works. They monitor each other's human rights. So that extinguishment policy is very hurtful. Aside from how it can be seen as effective in gaining Indigenous consent to having its jurisdiction violated by BC and Canada and other stuff, it hurts. It hurts people, and that's a big part of how these programs of extinguishment are successful, is because they do hurt people. They hurt their feelings. They hurt their spirit, and you can feel that. So, what happens when Native women are attacked, and then there's no justice? Or, for instance, we call this issue missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There have been commissions into what's happening there and inquiries. And aside from the fact that I feel strongly that those commissions came out with very skewed reports, and that we know that the courts and the police are not accountable. They're not investigating those disappearances. They're not investigating those murders, to the point where when the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights came to British Columbia to investigate the situation, because we had this sham of the Opal Commission with the Judge Wally Opal, who is known to be totally adversarial to Indigenous rights. I was in a courtroom once in 1994 where Wally Opal stood up. He was the judge and the defense in the Lilwat roadblock case, a later roadblock case, not the 1991, the 1994, 93 one. And they're trying to speak their defense. They're trying to say, well, we're not part of Canada. You can't accuse us and criminalize us for not obeying your court injunction, because your court doesn't have jurisdiction in Lilwat territory. We have jurisdiction in Lilwat territory. That's their defense. That's why they were blocking the logging roads that were headed down to the sacred smallpox burial grounds, as it happens. So usually in court, you get to say that. You get to say your defense. You get to say why you did what you did. Wally Opal, the judge in this case, stood up and shouted at their lawyer to stop talking and would not allow their lawyer even to make his opening defense statement, because he knew that they were going to say that. He knew that they were going to talk about sovereignty and jurisdiction. And so 4 times, at first he said, please stop, please don't say that. I don't want to hear you say that. And then the lawyer tried again, and he's like, my lord, I'm just giving my opening statement, and tries to talk so that the court recorder can record it. Wally Opal starts shouting, and the lawyer keeps trying to talk and keep trying to say their defense, which is quite simple. It's like a sentence or two. We don't have a treaty with Canada. You don't have jurisdiction here. That's all he was trying to say. And it got to the point where Wally Opal stood up at his podium and shouted over the lawyer and told him that he was going to hold him in contempt if he kept talking. This is their defense lawyer who's trying to present their defense in court. So that's who Wally Opal is. And that's the guy that they put in charge of the commission or the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women in British Columbia. Okay, so that's who that guy is. And the report that he came out with was so weak and so vague and had no recommendations. And then he was also in charge of investigating Vancouver police when the issue of Indigenous people dying in custody, in police custody, or very shortly after being released from police custody, like Frank Paul. He was also in charge of that, and his results, his idea was that the Vancouver Police Department should have some cultural sensitivity training. Okay. These are guys who dumped an unconscious man out in an alley full of snow in the middle of January. He died of exposure. So Wally Opal's idea is that Vancouver Police Department should have some cultural sensitivity training. What they probably need is some human rights training. You can't just kill people. Anyhow, so this is a really broad topic, and what happens when people are killed or people are left for dead is that it hurts communities. Communities can't. Communities are constantly burying people and looking for people. Young men and women go missing. This is not something that's in the past; it's in the present, and the police is not adequately investigating those. Um, that's for sure. And this problem has been pointed out in Canada's reviews by the United Nations treaty bodies, the Universal Periodic Review process, other countries. After all these reports and commissions that BC has been part of, other countries are asking Canada, what are you doing to mitigate this problem? And Canada is acting like, oh, well, we solved that. We had a commission. Do you know what it says on the Government of Canada's website when you really drill down past this report, that report, made a recommendation, recommended this. If you follow it all the way to the end of the recommendations, the place that you arrive at is Canada's anti-racism strategy. And so you have this kind of globalized federal anti-racism program, which is the only end result of any of these commissions in terms of changing policy or legislation or prosecuting offenders of these violent crimes. You end up at Canada's anti-racism strategy. So it's just, it's really stunning the way that they've gotten around that. And earlier I started out to say that when the Inter-American Human Rights Commission came to British Columbia to investigate the disappearance and murder of Indigenous women and girls, what they said in their report is that there is so little follow-up when a woman goes missing, or if a woman is killed, or if a woman is attacked. They discovered that there is so little police follow-up or investigation, and that cases are simply closed when they're not concluded, that they said people can attack Native women with impunity. That's the word that they used. Is that when you attack Native people, there's no consequences. And that is what they said when they came to British Columbia. So the parallel between violence against Native individuals and the violence against the community by the extinguishment process is clear. The Our quote unquote society hurts Native individuals, and it hurts Native peoples as groups with people's rights and land rights and political rights.
Terry, I just got to say before I ask my final question, I just got to say that being an ally for as long as I have now, I am acutely aware of all the issues that you're talking about. But I have to say, the level of detail that you provided in both Archive Quarterly and today has made me realize that I really underestimated the depth of how far this genocidal colonial system really goes down. I mean, it was in my intuition that it was complicated and dark and long and cold over a number of years, but hearing all these details are just a realization that, like I said, there's just so much more to it than even we realize as allies. And on the back of all that, where do you see the next stages of Indigenous resistance and resilient emerging? Is the next step direct action or militant conflict? Because as an ally, it doesn't seem like the oppression against Indigenous people as throughout the interview. It's ending anytime soon.
Yeah. It is deep and dark and cold. That's a good description of the situation here. And so it's very uncomfortable for non-native people to look at those facts. That's one thing I know for sure. And it takes a certain amount of courage, but the reward, the the personal reward for doing the right thing is always more than you can ever imagine. And that's how that each of us as individuals and also as collectives, that's how we live a beautiful, meaningful life, is by taking responsibility for what's going on around us. And it is shattering. It is absolutely shattering. Honestly, I've asked myself many times, if I was a Native person, would I have survived residential school? I don't think I would. I I don't think I would. Would I have survived? You know, statistically, the same number of people in my immediate family committing suicide. The reality for Native people, and I want to use the word urgent again, it is urgent. And so, in terms of what are the next stages of Indigenous resistance, which you have asked me, I'm not totally sure. I mean, Indigenous peoples always surprise me with their heart and creativity and the things that they come up with. I have no idea uh, what people are going to do next, but I have no doubt it's going to be awesome. I think the real question is, what are we going to do next? And the fact that on a day-to-day basis, our economy is devouring in native land and sacred land and land that you can't buy back. That can't be fixed. So what are we going to do next? And Um, for my part, I feel like I've gone so far down this road of searching up documentation and trying to heal up the historical record where a lot of material has been deliberately um, destroyed or not recorded at all in the first place. Um, I want to continue with that, and I want to support everything I can for people who are political activists and can figure out how are we going to change this situation. We need to take immediate measures at to do simple interim emergent these things like majorly expanding Indian reserves. Indian reserves are tiny. Those people have no access to their own resources, water, salmon in most cases. We hear about Aboriginal rights to fish, but the reality is, if you haven't won a court case, you don't have an Aboriginal right to fish for salmon. And the DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, keeps messing with people and charging them. Meanwhile, allowing a recreational fishery to take the vastly majority of Chinook and coho, the most important food fish, are allocated to other uh, to Canadians when they're not even supposed to be. So, what is the next step? What can we do? We need extensive, major systemic change in this province. There has to be recognition of Indigenous land title. That's another thing that the UN treaty bodies are constantly coming back to. Canada, you have to recognize that these people own land. The way it is right now, you can't dispose of any resource or access any resource or even lease some land if you're a native or native governance or chief and council. You can't do any of those things until you surrender to the government. That this is where we live, is that in order to lease or develop or sell or build a school somewhere, an Indian band or a First Nation literally has to make a surrender to the government in order to go forward with that. And other people will argue with that, but what they'll be doing is they'll be talking in semantics, because the government programs have a whole dictionary that of words that only mean one thing when they're negotiating with Native people, and they don't use the word extinguishment anymore. They say, oh, we're going to have recognition and reconciliation of rights. Well, guess what that means? It means extinguishment. So our job here is we have a huge infrastructure that is based on resource extraction and that is based on very elaborately denying Indigenous people's rights, and we need to do something. We need to fix that.
I think I speak for both Kimberly and I when I say that we wholeheartedly agree with you. We need to do something. Right? We need to do our part.
Thank you, Kerry, for bringing us the correct perspective that needs to be shared. And we hope to do our part in sharing this perspective across the land that we are on. We are very thrilled to have Archive Quarterly available at Camus Books, and soon we're also going to have your book, The Colonial Present, in stock. We're just working on that right now, and people can come into our store and learn more from you directly through your important work that you're contributing to our movement.
Thank you very much for doing that. And I'm so glad that Camus Books exist. It's so important that that as a center where people can meet and where people can access information. And I know that you guys are a big part of that project. So thank you so much, Cookston Caleb.
Thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. Take care, you folks.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you.
If
Thank you.
Jesus Christ came back today like you threatened he will, which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how yourself, well,